Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of our series entitled To Consider and Praise. I'm Pastor Zach McGowan. I'm so glad that you've taken this time to journey with us through the Psalms. Today we're jumping into one of those more odd Psalms, Psalm 39, but I'm really glad that you're here. You know, whenever we're in trouble or hurting or just not doing well, we may react in a variety of different ways. Some people, they complain incessantly. You know, they tell everyone about what they're going through. I know people who, they get even the tiniest little hangnail. They're intent on sharing the plight of that hangnail as though it's the most important thing, the worst thing that has ever happened to them. Others are just the opposite. And this really kind of describes me. I don't really want to talk about it when I'm going through something. I'm fine. I don't want to talk about it. That's the common internal and sometimes external refrain for me when I'm really going through something. We all react differently to times of hardship, turmoil, whether those are physical things, emotional things, or even philosophical things. You know, as we open up Psalm 39 today, we're going to see the psalmist struggling. He's struggling to speak about what's going on. And in that struggle, he ultimately reaches out to the Lord. But before we jump into the content of Psalm 39, I want to take a second and think through the title or the superscription of this psalm. We do this from time to time because, as I've said really at the beginning of our series, I believe that those titles, those superscriptions, are canonical. And in this case, the superscription simply says to the choir master, to Jeduthun, a psalm of David. Now, when you first read this, it seems kind of straightforward. In the English especially, we read this is a psalm by David or inspired by David or in the style of David, and it's given to one of David's chief musicians, a guy named Jeduthun. And if you look at the Old Testament and some of the musicians that David himself employed, there is such a person. In 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 16, and later in chapter 16, verse 38. There's a guy named Jeduthun. So, case closed, right? Well, some people believe this isn't referring to a person, but that the word Jeduthun refers to the style or type of psalm. The Hebrew root indicates that this is a confession, or maybe just as likely a psalm of thanksgiving. That's the root word of that word Jeduthun. But when you look at the content of Psalm 39, that doesn't really match up with either of those assessments. This is a weird psalm for sure. So we're going to go with the more widespread consensus that this is a person and that this is actually a psalm written by David. But the content of this psalm is so very personal that it's difficult to think of how it would be set in a particular corporate worship context. And the fact that it's written to Jeduthun indicates that this would be given some sort of a corporate worship context. This is a psalm of individual lament, and it's very personal. And while we can't be for certain what the actual issue is at hand, some have conjectured that this psalm is prompted by an illness, and they compare it to the psalm we talked about last week, Psalm 38. And that may be the case. But in Psalm 38, the psalmist ties the physical illness with a deeply spiritual dilemma. Others believe, like Frank Gabeling, that David is vexed with unsolved quest for meaning. The problem is it's not physical, it's existential in a sense. And that may be true as well. And indeed, when you look at especially places like verses 4 through 6, it seems to back that up. But one of the biggest challenges in reading Psalm 39 is how to interpret it thematically. J. Clinton McCann, in the New Interpreter's Commentary, he cites disparate views of this chapter. Some people call this a psalm of despair, with the writer plunged into, quote, darkness unparalleled. Others claim it is a psalmist who's showing great perspective and actually has a sense of calm and spiritual maturity. as he faces death. The reality, McCann concludes anyway, is probably somewhere in the middle. And I really like this because reality itself is someplace in the middle. Hope, despair, tragedy, victory, they often lie side by side. McCann writes that this psalm presents the reality as it is, that life is terrifyingly short and yet awesomely wonderful. Now, as we kind of explore this psalm structurally, we're going to follow the expositor's commentary. And in the expositor's commentary, it cites 3 repeating parallel movements that kind of look like this. In verses 1 through 3, we see the writer in silence before the Lord, followed then by a prayer for divine illumination, and then a prayer for deliverance. Then there's a repetition. There's silence before the Lord once again, and then a prayer for, this time, not illumination, but sustenance. Finally, the writer concludes with a prayer for deliverance. The silence in both movements prompts 2 sets of prayers. First, for illumination, that's understanding. And the second, to be sustained in light of that understanding. And also a repetition of a prayer for deliverance. So we begin with this silence of David in verses 1 through 3. Silence before the Lord. So let's read this section together. David writes, I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle, so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail. In my distress, it grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Now, I want you to take a second and just think through those 3 verses for yourself, because the writer is talking to himself here. He's determined not to compound whatever problems he's facing by sinning with his words. He's silent. He's not been struck silent, but he's choosing to be silent. The idea that he muzzles himself implies that he kind of wants to speak. It's not that he doesn't want to talk, but that he won't talk, especially since his enemies, the wicked, are in his presence. Now, why doesn't he want to talk? The idea is that he might be provoked to sin, to further sin. It's interesting that when you look forward into the New Testament, it seems like David understood what James would write hundreds of years later. In James chapter 1, verse 26, James writes these words about silence. He says, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. It's worthless if you can't bridle your tongue. So many times I wish I would have been silent when I spoke, because it did. It led to sin. The psalmist here wants to stay humble and submissive before the Lord. And he knows if he speaks, he might be provoked to anger. And indeed, he is provoked to speak. In verse 3, the silence has actually caused him anger, literal heartburn. He's angry. The words and the metaphors used here in these couple of verses are also used in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 6. There, that metaphor describes what happens when a person learns that a loved one has been killed. There's a grief mixed with anger. In fact, anger is often thought of as one of the stages of grief. And that anger is intense. And the silence that David exhibits here, the silence that he puts himself under, it only causes that anger to boil over more, to the point that David does speak. Verse 3 ends in the English with a continuation into verse 4. And so David speaks. He says, O Lord, make me know my end. And what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days just a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Selah. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. In his words, he prays to know what's next. He doesn't accuse the Lord of injustice, but there's an acknowledgement. He wants an acknowledgement that there is an end, kind of a border, so to speak, of his life, and he wants to know what it's all about. Why? If life has an end, if life has this border, what is life all about? And in verse 4, there's a threefold repetition, that he may know just what it means to be able to live into the briefness of human existence. In some ways, verses 4 through 6 reminds me of the book of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes, there's the main speaker. He's called the teacher or the preacher, and he bemoans the seeming meaninglessness of life, and he bemoans the brevity of it all. In a summation of the overall thrust of the book, we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, all things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Now, if you keep reading the book of Ecclesiastes, in the end, there's one thing that the teacher concludes that does matter. And what matters? Following the way of the Lord. Following in the relationship with God. Following after his commandments. And a similar understanding is found in Psalm 39. The writer understands that all the earthly efforts, everything that we do, everything that we toil over, they come to nothing. That's a big theme in the book of Ecclesiastes. And life is just a few handbreadths. Now, the handbreadth, we don't really talk about the breadth of a hand, and it was actually the breadth of 4 fingers, literally. And it was one of the smallest units of measurement for the Hebrew people. Life is also described as a shadow. The word for shadow can also mean a phantom, and it reveals that the writer thinks that life is only appears to be permanent, only appears to be real. But in reality, it's a breath. The Hebrew word is quite literally a vapor. That word is used over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's also a connection to Psalm 37. If you flip back to Psalm 37, there is a meditation on the transitory nature of life. But there, the psalmist calls out the life of the wicked specifically as brief. The life of the righteous, on the other hand, is more permanent. And it's more permanent in light of the righteous relationship to the Lord. But here, the observation is much broader. All of humanity is brief. Nothing that anyone does is truly gathered together in any kind of permanent way. That's a pretty depressing thought. And if this were the way the psalm ended, then it would be easy to devolve into a theology of nihilism, of total meaninglessness. And in fact, a few people have actually charged the book of Ecclesiastes with being nihilistic. But the psalmist doesn't end with verse 6. And Ecclesiastes doesn't end with chapter 1 either. But instead, the psalmist here goes from a prayer for understanding or illumination, to know what life really is all about, to a prayer of deliverance. So he continues to pray in verse 7. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? Some translations might say, but now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. The prayer in verses 4 through 6 has revealed sobering truth to David. Life is brief. And so now he turns to the Lord with another basic question. What do I wait for? Where is my hope? There may have been times in David's life or he placed his sense of security and identity in wealth, or nation building, or success over his enemies. But here he emphatically calls the Lord his hope. And now he faces his own internal struggle with sin. See, the condition of humanity, it's important. It may be valuable to contemplate the ephemeral nature of all of life, but what's pressing on David's mind in light of the ephemeral nature of all of life is the state of his own soul. If the Lord is his hope, how does he really rest in the Lord? At times, we can get so distracted with the big questions, the big questions of life, the philosophical notions of meaning, that we don't attend to our personal souls. This is a real problem, especially amongst theologians and scholars. We're so busy thinking thoughts about God, we don't attend to where our soul is with God. David has the realization that in this illumination, this understanding of the brevity of life of all people, that he's falling to that temptation, not attending to his own sin. But the suffering of his sin is what matters most. So he prays for deliverance. He prays for rescue. He's humble. His life is short compared to the eternal God. And so this humility causes him to once again fall totally silent before God. He says in verse 9, I am mute. I do not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. At the outset of the chapter, the writer is quiet. But the difference here is that he doesn't want to speak. He doesn't want to speak because of his sin. He cannot speak because of his sin. And he places the reason at the foot of God. God has caused this silence. God's deliverance is sure in the writer's mind, but it comes with discipline. And so he prays for God to sustain him in the middle of that discipline. He says in verse 10, remove your stroke from me. I'm spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. Selah. It's a difficult thing to kind of swallow, that sometimes God's reaction to our sin can be severe. He allows us to feel the temporal effects of our sin, and the discipline of correction can be painful. The one who genuinely seeks out his own sobriety must go through the pain of withdrawal. The one who comes clean about a financial scheme must face the discipline of court proceedings and financial ruin. The effects of our iniquities on this earth, they in order for them to change us, they must be accepted as discipline. And this is the writer's conclusion. Even death itself, that brevity of life, that's the result of the fallen world. Now, we talked about the fact that not all the problems we face are the result of our personal individual sin, but the problems we face are the result of the fallenness of this world. Those moments that we experience discipline, the moments that the writer experienced discipline, it felt like a wound or a stroke. But this is the result of God's deliverance. We might ask, is that really worth it? Especially if one doesn't have a theology of resurrection, which was absent from the majority of ancient Hebrew understandings. Is it really worth it to accept the discipline of God? This is one of the struggles the Ecclesiastes writer has. And he at one point contends that really we should just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But that isn't the teacher or preacher's final conclusion. He wrestles with it for sure. Yet what the teacher concludes and what Psalm 39 rests in is that it's far better to live according to the ways of the Lord than to live for the self. And that means accepting the discipline that comes. Their reasoning, why, is based on the firm idea that God has ordained all of life. And so to live in accordance with that ordination that's a blessing in and of itself. To even have the opportunity to follow after God is a blessing. The concluding prayer for deliverance is similar to that of verses 7 through 8, primarily because there doesn't really appear to be any conclusion. Let's look at how this psalm ends in these final two verses. David writes, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Look away from me, that I may smile again before I depart and am no more." In some ways, when you read this, there's a sense of resignation in the psalmist, but there's also a sense of contentment. Like Psalm 38, there's no celebration. There's no call to thanksgiving and praise, but there is implied hope. Now, he's explicitly said that God is his hope, but here he implies that there's hope because God hears his prayer and has the ability to provide peace. The certainty of other psalms is not as present, though at the same time, the acknowledgement that God has sojourned or traveled with the people, not just with the psalmist, but for generations, it reflects kind of a legacy view of the covenant community. God has been there for his people. So he'll be there again for the writer. So he calls out. He calls out for mercy. But the cry for mercy in this closing verse, it's very different than anything we've seen thus far in the Psalms. He actually prays for God to look away from him so that he might smile, that he might have joy before he dies. Now, this is a stark contrast to Psalms that ask or long for the face of the Lord. If you look at Psalms like Psalm chapter 4 and verse 6, for example, or Psalm chapter 10, verse 11, or Psalm chapter 11, verse 7, or chapter 13, verse 1, and you're going to see it again later, all represent a desire for God to look graciously and intimately on the writer. They want God's attention, but not so here. Job utters a similar phrase to Psalm 39, to look away. He does so in chapter 7, chapter 10, chapter 14 of the book of Job. And here, in this discipline experience, David is feeling as though God is looking angrily at him. That's not something that he can be happy about. As Peter Craigie reflects on this psalm, he highlights how the chapter appears to be from the words of a man who is of advanced age and who longs for the release of death because the final discipline has closed out his life. If you look at the life of David, that certainly is reflected in his experience. He lived righteously so much of his life. He was called a man after God's own heart. But then he has this tragic sin, the adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah. And that incident sent David's life into a decades-long tailspin. Violence, sexual immorality, they never really left his household. He repented, but the effects of that sin played out throughout his life. That sin, that discipline, taught David a difficult lesson about how to live with the transitory nature of this life. That idea always being before a person. The conclusion is that only in humble reliance on the Lord can a life really be lived, even with all of its smoke-like impermanence. Craigie also points out that this concept of the sojourner and the temporality of life, it's reflected in the New Testament era. Like the psalmist, the Hebrews writer says of the great leaders of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, these all died. All those heroes of the Old Testament, they died in faith. They didn't receive the things promised, But having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers, exiles, or sojourners on this earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. That's something better that was promised. It came through Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, who was from the line of David through Solomon, who was the son of Bathsheba and David. Jesus Christ, he is that better something, the fulfillment of the promises offered to all the sojourners in the Old Testament. And at the same time, the mentality of being kind of a resident alien, a sojourner, still matters to us as we navigate the meaning of this life here on earth. There are some who would take such a call from Hebrews and coupled with the silent and philosophical spiritual dilemma of David in Psalm 39, they would look at that and they would conclude that what we're really supposed to do is to look past this life and only focus on the next. I mean, by comparison, this life is smoke and dust, but the eternal life, it's solid and sure. But if that's how we're supposed to react, that would really pervert the witness of Psalm 39. The sojourner not only seeks a better country, but he also faithfully walks with the Lord on the journey to that better country. Notice in Psalm 39, God is walking with the writer. To do that, to walk towards that better country with the Lord, it means a commitment to do good for the sake of the Lord's will, to be witnesses to Jesus Christ in word and deed. While our permanence and our hope are certainly not found here in this life, in the accumulation of wealth or awards, the hope of the next life compels us to influence this life for the sake of God's kingdom. You know, the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes points back to a right relationship with the Lord, as I said earlier. Here's how it concludes really in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. The end of the matter, he writes, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. We are not perfect, of course, at this. We don't perfectly follow the commands of God, but that's why Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection provides us an even further hope and simultaneously a motivation to live in gratitude, to live this temporary life in gratitude for him, to him, for all that he's done for us. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, we thank you that even though this life is impermanent, it's temporary, that because of Jesus, we have a sure and certain hope. Help us to live into that hope, not always just looking to the eternal, but being motivated by that, the eternal, to see your kingdom will done on this earth as it is in heaven. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks for joining me, everybody. And if you would like to join me on a deeper discussion through Psalm 39, I invite you to email me at the email address below so you can get the information for our Zoom discussion at 6 p.m. on Monday nights. That's 6 p.m. on Monday nights. If you'd like that information, go ahead and email me. I look forward to it. We'll see you next time.